2001 was an exciting year for the Robert H. Jackson Center. Not only did we organize, we incorporated, we purchased a 19,000 square foot facility, not knowing what we'd do with 1,000 square feet. It was important as part of that organization that we launch, that we do something which in fact brought credibility to the Robert H. Jackson Center, which was just a nascent organization with a dream, a hope, a prayer, and a dream. So I remember our first meetings at the Robert H. Jackson Center were actually at the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation, with a shout out to Randy Sweeney, who at the Chautauqua Region Community Foundation was not only our initial secretary and a muse of mine, but also provided the facilities upon which we originally met. Then, as we purchased the building, we actually started meeting here. And if we're currently at the Grant Room, we had literally a fold-out table, a basic fold-out, sit in the middle of the table.
To answer the other issue, at least from my point of view, if you notice. And then from that initial report, that would let everyone know what the condition of the building is. Then the board would have to then prioritize how to address those issues. Here, come in and find out the other side of the coin, so to speak, with New York.
It gives us an idea of what it's going to cost to get this thing fixed.
And then we'd sit down at the committee and go through here and say, what do you want changed? The carpet's got to go, obviously.
And we'd meet weekly. It would be Carl, and when Carl was unable to be here because of health, it was Jeanette Carlson, and Bruce, and Judge Cass, Bruce Janowski, Judge Cass, Raleigh Kidder, Randy Sweeney, myself, Dan Bratton, and we met weekly. This wasn't one of those meet quarterly and just sort of get together to talk. We were really planning. Why were we planning? One, we wanted to launch a big program. Two, we noticed the fact that this building was in terrible condition. The roof leaked. It needed everything. The ceilings were cracked. The gold was peeling off, and it was leaking. This was not a safe place to be. So we knew at the same time we had to figure out ways to use some of the money we received as capital to, in fact, enhance the building. So that was going on. And also I remember during our early meetings that one of the first issues that came up was what was going to be the role of the Robert H. Jackson Center with regards to programming. And at the time, the hot issue was the United States not being in the International Criminal Court created through the Rome Treaty. And the question was, since we're the Robert H. Jackson Center, he was the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial, it would seem like to some on the board that we should send out at least a notice, a letter advocating the United States to be involved in this permanent tribunal. And it led to our first conversation of policy. This is policy, because heretofore we've been kind of caught up with how we're going to protect the building, save the building, policy. And I don't remember who it was, but it was Judge Cass perhaps that raised the question. And then somebody on the board says, do we know that? Do we know that Robert Jackson would in fact want us to advocate the United States being in a permanent international criminal court? So we tabled it. And we said, we'll bring it up when the hoped for, we weren't sure it was going to happen, hoped for Nuremberg prosecutors would get here in October, and we'd ask them. Later, but I remember that distinctly as one of our first big policy issues of whether or not to get engaged in advocacy as opposed to merely raising the issue and having people discuss it. I mentioned the fact that we knew the building was, again, 19,000 square feet, and it was in great need of repair. We hired Don Bloomquist, Don Blomquist, who knew the building quite well through his Masonic relationship, and he had ideas, a lot of good ideas, and he brought in architects and contractors, and all with a design. And in fact, around here is in fact there's some major designs as to what would happen to this facility. So we hired Don, and in reviewing 2001, you'll see lots of construction on the outside, lots of construction on the inside. Most importantly, protect the building by roofing and other related activities. Extraordinary event. And overseeing everything, Randy Sweeney.
It's a beautiful day today.
Unrelated, but through really contacts with a guy named Paul Benson. Paul was one of our initial advisors, knew Dan Bratton very well, and you'll see pictures of Paul attending all of our board meetings. Sort of an ad hoc advisor. But at the same time, Paul was intimately involved with Jamestown High School applying for a history grant, a significant, six-figure history grant led by Rick Walters. They felt that the Robert H. Jackson Center and our printed mission, again, we're a nascent organization, would in fact be a good collaborator. And in fact, that happened. And we did not only that first year with Rick and Paul, got involved in the application, which then led to them getting lots of money for several years, and which ultimately led to various programs we did in the years thereafter. As I mentioned earlier, that we had to launch with great and significant programs that would get the attention that we're for real. And gosh, we just finally closed on a deal April 1st. By May 1st, 1 month later, we had our first big event, which was Eugene Gerhardt, the biographer of Robert H. Jackson, America's Advocate. Coordinated event with the Jamestown Bar Association was Law Day 2001. It was a big program here. At the same time, we commemorated the Carl Kappa Theater. So we had the Kappa family. What was of significance that night was the fact that there was a young professor from St. John's University School of Law who attended. And there, Professor John Q. Barrett was at that event, May 1st, 2001, to meet us, to meet Eugene Gerhardt, to meet Harold Adams, the nephew of Robert H. Jackson, and to really become our first introduction to somebody who became very significant up to today in the growth of the Robert H. Jackson Center. I told the story, but it's interesting when he first reached out to me because he just started working on the biography of Robert Jackson. He just started working on the book, That Man. He called me and introduced himself, and he felt like he had almost, convinced me that he was significant, that he was real. And he sent me a draft of That Man. I have it in a Marine Midland Bank binder, of all things. And if you're from Jamestown, you know how dated that is. But that was John. He sent it, and then we met. And that becomes significant for that particular day in question. That night was spectacular. That launched us. And that also led to, in fact, on reflection, that was sort of the beginning of a transition. That first event not only was the first launch, but shortly thereafter, one of our principal benefactors, Carl Kappa, passed away. And our first president, Dan Bratton, former president of Chautauqua Institution, who in fact, in the archives, has wrote out our guidelines for what the Jackson Center could be. It still, when you read it today, envisions what we could be and what we should be. They were both subsequently recognized by Judge Joe Gerasi at the Supreme Court. It was just crazy. And I sought guidance and advice from a lot of people. At the time, we were also spending summers at Chautauqua Institution, and that's a myriad of people who could be tapped. Joe Raitt was one of them. He was from Seattle, and an educator and a significant philanthropist. And he gave us some early guidance, and in fact, his family has been involved ever since then. Another person very significant was Michael Berenbaum. Michael Berenbaum was one of the curators and initiators of the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. I met him at lunch one day. I said, would you like to come down and see this brand new organization, sit in the theater, Kappa Theater at the time, and just kind of give us your thoughts? And he did. And I had the board members sit around in a semicircle. Mike was sitting in the seats, and he knew enough about Jackson to say, here's what you need to do. Here are some things you need to focus in on and do very well. And he knew the biography. He knew that you've got to focus in on the three principal parts of his public career, which was the Solicitor General, Attorney General, Justice of the Supreme Court, his Nuremberg trial, which is incredibly important to certainly the Jewish family because of the Nuremberg trial, and his biography. His biography is like no other. A guy never went to college, never graduated from law school, and you need to focus just on those things and do them well. You need to educate the people. What is a Solicitor General? What is an Attorney General? What is a Justice of the Supreme Court? What was the Nuremberg trial? That's your mission. Try not to do much more than that. And that's all on video. And I didn't know that, I'm sure you didn't know we were going to interview you and transcribe your idle thoughts as you were, not idle, but as your brain was circulating. But much has happened.
Well, I'll tell you what I feel honored by is that 11 years later, I'm not embarrassed by what I wrote 11 years ago. That's really, you honor me. Thank you.
Well, you honor us, and I'm thrilled. And you've already given us a couple more ideas, and because we are a work in progress.
Yeah, no, every museum, every institution, it's a work in progress or it dies. What's clear is that a little bit of the direction in which this is going, which is it's not only a commemoration of the past and of a great justice, but also, and a great prosecutor, it's also going to have to deal with the wider issues, which is, in terms of American jurisprudence, the struggle for liberty and freedom and the rule of law, and in terms of the international community, the ongoing struggle to find a way to deal with the perpetrators of mass murder and death. And part of what you're doing is giving a home to these issues, and part of what we're seeing evolving here is a place that will represent the best of the spirit of Robert Jackson, not only in commemoration of the 20th century, but in order to move forward to the 21st century. And I would think that this place will not only celebrate the life of Robert Jackson, the achievements of Robert Jackson, but also the spirit of Robert Jackson going forward, because you always, part of what all museums do is they have a changing audience. Even if they have a stable exhibition, their audience changes. Consequently, the eyes that see a museum see it differently.
You're an amazing guy.
Thank you.
Did you ever say that to you?
Thank you.
That's Michael Berenbaum. Harold Adams. Harold Adams was the nephew of Robert Jackson, and Harold Adams was he kind of looked like Jackson. In fact, when there was the official portrait, which is, I'm looking at it right here, painted by Laura Colburn, much of the attributes were used when she brought him to her studio and used a lot of that.
One of the few folks in our audience today who had a close and intimate relationship with Justice Jackson was there frequently to add guidance and criticism. And then he left a voicemail one day, and I knew we'd arrived. Said he'd been out to Laura Colburn's and, quote, "Painting is finished, and it is, in my opinion, one of the best Jackson portraits ever made, anytime, anywhere," end of quote, Harold Adams. So with that backdrop, I'm pleased to introduce Laura Colburn, and we can unveil the portrait at this time.
he would provide us not only exhibitry, but he obviously knew Uncle Bob. He knew Uncle Bob and gave us insight, gave us exhibitry, some of the most extraordinary exhibitry, including Harold Adams, being at the Nuremberg trial during the time of the judgment at Nuremberg. He actually had a score sheet. He was there taking notes while he was there. In fact, he tells the story, and it's worth repeating, that he was just a private. And all of a sudden, it was October of 1946. And this commanding officer came in and goes, "You're to report to the motor pool, okay? And you're going to get on a Jeep and somebody's going to drive you to Nuremberg." What? Yes, we got a missive from General Jackson, because that was his title there, was General Jackson. They gave him an actual title. And you are to attend the trial. He goes, "I don't know how you know that, how you could get through with this," but all of a sudden he's there sitting in on the moment of the verdicts in the morning. And then he explains in great detail, he was there at the verdicts, and then he had lunch with Robert Jackson and other people while they waited at lunchtime, and then going back in the afternoon for the actual judgments, the hangings, the life imprisonment, etc. And Harold Adams has this script, which we have. And that was remarkable. And he stayed on our board right up until the very end, and we had a special exhibit of his items here at the Jackson Center in 2005, 2006, I forget. But Harold Adams was a major part at our early year. Another was Tom and Susie Hagen. Tom Hagen and Susie were major contributors, philanthropists at Chautauqua. They were the Erie insurance folks. And I had dinner with them in Jamestown, and before the dinner we brought them here. And Tom and Susie sat down, it was just the three of us, and I told them a little bit about us, and then Tom, I remember it distinctly, looked me in the eyes and says, "Greg," sort of repeating a little bit of Michael Berenbaum, says, "You know, you got amazing three pillars." He went through those public Nuremberg bio. And he says, "Avoid at all costs, because the name, and I'll look at Robert H. Jackson Center for Justice, is what we're called. That wasn't our formal incorporator name. We just used that." He goes, "People are going to glom onto you who are justice-oriented, who are well-intentioned, but they'll want to go on your coattails. Avoid it. Stay clear and stick with the three main points and accent them." As if he was underscoring Michael Berenbaum, but that was Tom and Susie. Tom subsequently became a member of our board of directors and a major philanthropist for us through the Erie Community Foundation. Kidder knew somebody who was the head of a brand new not-for-profit organization in Pekin, Illinois. Pekin, Illinois, called the Dirksen Center, named after Everett Dirksen, minority leader of the United States Senate. He had just died. And so through a contact, Raleigh was a pilot friend of his, and a client of mine, Dan Weinstein, we got on a jet. Jeanette, Randy Sweeney, Raleigh, and I got on a jet in Jamestown and went to Pekin, Illinois. And there we met and spent the day at the Dirksen Center. And it was interesting because here's this, they were well funded. They got a ton of money from Congress. Congressional money was being earmarked for Dirksen, he had just died, and Republican, and then also for Hubert Humphrey, Democrat, who had just died. So they were kind of spread out millions of dollars. And they really didn't have much of a history. So the guys at the Dirksen Center said, "You know, what you've got that we don't have, you have somebody who's going to live, his legacy is going to live long after Everett Dirksen, long after people, Hubert Humphrey, because they're personalities, and once that personality is gone, it's gone." Jackson not so much personality is why we remember him today. It's what he wrote, what he did, what he accomplished. That's the legacy. You guys are lucky. So the head of the Dirksen Center, multi-million-dollar, well-funded, and it was, we got a chance to see how they were set up, gave us a lot of confidence of what we were going to do. Dr. Lillian Ney, who was also active at Chautauqua and a member of the Chautauqua Women's Club, somehow got on the program committee up at Chautauqua, and she allowed us how there's this brand new Robert H. Jackson Center. Greg Peterson's one of the co-founders. We should invite him to speak at one of our events. So she kind of, because Lillian is a force of nature, said you should do that. And it was July 18th, 2001. She goes, I've plugged you in as the speaker. Now, I could hardly spell Jackson, let alone know how to fill up 45 to 50 minutes of Chautauqua kind of speaking. So I knew I needed help. I panicked. So I reached out to a Nuremberg prosecutor named Ted Fenstermacher. He was a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial, and he was in Cortland, New York, and he agreed to come. I go, great. I'll do the introduction, and I will have a real deal Ted Fenstermacher. I'm going to look good, because I can at least do 5 to 10 minutes. That's all I got. That's all I got in my bag. Well, as would have it, Ted got very ill, very sick, and could not make it. So within a week prior to this or so, he called and says, I can't do it, sorry. And I go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? He's advertised. So I called and reached out to this brand new guy I met only once or twice, John Barrett. I said, John, would you be interested in coming in and covering for me? I mean, really covering for me. And so he did. So John came, we called, and he conquered. That was his first speech at Chautauqua Institution, courtesy of Lillian Ney of the Chautauqua Women's Club. And it was at the Hall of Philosophy, and it was packed to the gills. Clearly, we knew that was an audience. And I stumbled along, and John, sealed the deal.
Nuremberg. This is a story you know well, and I'll summarize briefly. The war is winding down in the spring of 1945 in Europe, and the question in many circles is what to do with the Nazi leaders upon Allied victory. What he does first is go to London, and in an amazing feat of diplomatic work over the summer of 1945, negotiates the structure that brings the 4 disparate legal systems together: Britain, France, Soviet Union, United States, and defines the code of crimes that will be used to evaluate and indict and prosecute. They then go to Berlin. Indictments are returned. 22 principal Nazi leaders: Hermann Goering, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Rudolf Hess, Admiral Karl Dönitz, Julius Streicher, the disseminator of viciously anti-Semitic propaganda, etc., are the defendants. And the trial begins in November 1945. Jackson is there in a context that, frankly, in some ways must have reminded him of the Mellon case, right? A winner prosecuting a loser, a winner blaming a loser for all the world's evils. Of course, now we're just talking about a collapsed economy and the rich and the poor. We were talking about the atrocities of World War II. And what Jackson has to work out, really as the lead prosecutor among the 4 countries, is how to do that job. He made a decision that was hard at the time and, frankly, I think, cut down on the popular acclaim at the time. He decided, once the investigative phase had found that this kind of evidence existed, to prosecute the case on the basis of captured Nazi documents. Now that makes for a great record, which makes for great history. It does not make for good newsreel footage, and it does not make for exciting trial headlines in the next day's papers. But he refused to do a case that involved making deals with cooperators who would then tell stories about Goering knew this and Hess knew that, because the ruthlessly compulsive documentation that the Third Reich had left and the Allies had captured showed a paper trail that allowed the case to be tried on documents. Now, what did he find and what did that prove? Well, that is the record of the Holocaust. That was something that was only dimly understood in May of 1945. The camps had been liberated and reports had made its way back, but it became much more profoundly understood over the course of this year where Jackson did this work. In the end, what's the proof that it was successful? There were acquittals. 3 defendants, were acquitted. That only happens in a real trial. Look at Soviet show trials or any place else where a police state does show trials. You never hear not guilty at the end of one of those. You got not guilty at the end of these. And although Jackson thought the tribunal cut it a little too fine on a few defendants, in general, he was pleased with that. What this model created, as Greg has alluded to, is the model that's very much in play today. Not only the Rwanda and Yugoslavia tribunals, but the coming International Criminal Court, which will take effect by treaty in about 3 years when 60 nations around the world ratify it.
And interestingly enough, one of the people who came up from the audience was a lady named Gertrude Moretti. Who was she? She was a secretary at the Nuremberg trial and a secretary to Whitney Harris. So here she is in the audience. So we paused and interviewed her as well. Now that becomes important soon hereafter, this first year. Again, this is all happening wildly this first year. I then learned that one of the Nuremberg translators and investigators named Ambassador John Dollarboys was on his way to Buffalo to speak. I just happened to read it someplace. So I reached out, and he came here. In the Jamestown Bar Association and Rotary, we met with Ambassador Dollarboys, and he was spectacular. Nobody left at all. They were mesmerized by him. So not only did he speak for like an hour, he had everybody tuned in, and then he hung around and was interviewed for like 2 hours. Just a fount of knowledge. And John, Ambassador and Dollarboys, came back one other time at Chautauqua because he was that good. And then he also is a player in the Nuremberg movie. Jack L. Hay talks about how the psychiatrist Douglas Kelly used John Dollarboys as his translator. So that was important. After graduating from Miami University in 1942, he joined the Army. And there he was part of the military intelligence. He assisted in the interrogation of the Nazi war criminals prior to the Nuremberg trials. He had an opportunity to interview Goering, Donitz, Ribbentrop, and many others, and has a unique experience as being one of only 5 members of the U.S. Army intelligence interrogation units. Here is his reflections.
And I think the challenge was, and he explained that to us in a speech on the 9th of September, and I know you have that in your archives. It doesn't say where that speech was given, but according to my memory, it was given at Nuremberg to all of us who were involved in the trials. The legal staffs, prosecutors, the guard element, the officers of the guards, and the military intelligence people and people like me. And he explained the purpose of the trials to us. And I quote him in my book. And that quote in my book comes from memory out of the speech he gave, I think it was on the 9th of September, that you have in your archives here. And that is what he stressed was to prevent future aggressive wars, illegal aggressive wars, where one nation invades another nation and violates its territory, enslaves its people, commits genocide.
That was September. Again, we're trying to do things which were get a lot of attention. So we tried to bring in people who were the real deals, who were one step from Robert Jackson, because he died in '54, we couldn't get him. So then we thought we'd really try to do a big one, working with John Barrett. Now John's in the orbit, to do it on the 55th anniversary of the judgment at Nuremberg, to bring in all that we could find of the surviving Nuremberg prosecutors. Enter Marty Coyle again. I mentioned his name. Marty Coyle had mentioned that he was the general counsel for TRW in Cleveland. Big job. And his associate counsel was Henry King, who was at Nuremberg. He was at the Nuremberg trial. He goes, here, you can call Henry. I bet he might be a person who would know. He could help you get started, because I was kind of flailing. And so I called Henry, and he said, sure, I'll be glad to come. I'm glad to come, but you don't have an event without Whitney Harris. You just don't have an event. Whitney is the guy. Why? Because Whitney Harris was the second seat. He was as close as you got to Jackson, and he's in St. Louis. And so we reached out to another guy named Bernie Meltzer, who was from Chicago, and Bernie said, same thing. I'd be glad to come, but you don't have anything about Whitney Harris. So clearly, we needed Whitney Harris. So we reached out to him, and he gladly accepted coming out here. It was in late October of 2001. I'm now feeling good about the fact we got 3 Nuremberg prosecutors. I thought, well, let's make it really bigger than life. So I reached out to C-SPAN to say, because they had a special program on justice and the law or something like that ran on Saturdays. And they agreed to come. So they came, hired I think a group out of Rochester to film it. And we filmed it, they filmed it. We had two sets of 3 cameras all over the place. This magic event, C-SPAN. So again, this is all the first year. We aren't even a year old and we've got all these Nuremberg prosecutors. As it turned out, another Nuremberg prosecutor who we had not even invited, James Conway, got on a train that day and just showed up. Unbelievable.
A truly brilliant, dedicated, honest leader of men. I think that Justice Jackson has to go down as possibly the finest legal writer of the last century. I mean, his composition is incredible. You talked about, did we help him in his speeches? He didn't need any help with his speeches. As far as phraseology is concerned, as far as, he's just an absolute master. So, he's really, and he made a tremendous contribution, I think, to our own civilization in assuming the responsibility of affording the Germans an opportunity to defend themselves after the end of the last war and proving their criminality.
So that was the magic of the first year, to really get us launched and to showcase that we were real. Also, interestingly enough, in the audience that day, and I didn't know him, I didn't even know he was in the audience, was a guy named Doug Neckers. Doug Neckers just there, watched it, and he then became enthralled, and Doug Neckers became ultimately our chairman of our board for a period of time, a big philanthropist for us and a big leader. I'll conclude with the fact that the first year really was the fact that we had our second president named Raleigh Kidder. So the board, Raleigh had been on the board, so he was not unknown. But in a Post-Journal article of November 18th, 2001, I'll read it. Raleigh Kidder has been named executive director of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown. The board of directors of the Robert H. Jackson Center were pleased that Mr. Kidder had agreed to become our next executive director and described who he was. He's a former state legislator, an attorney, a Navy veteran, and a wide-ranging historical interest in World War II and America's involvement in it. He's an ideal person to head up this new organization, which is dedicated to preserving and fostering the ideas of Supreme Court Justice and Nuremberg prosecutor Robert H. Jackson. We were so thrilled to get Raleigh, and I remember how that kind of happened, and it's just maybe a postscript of how it's meant to be. Raleigh and I and our wives were invited to a wedding in Florida. It was a destination wedding of Paul Bush, president of Bush Industries, and he was there, I was there. And Peter Sullivan, who was Raleigh's boss at PB Sullivan and Company, said, Raleigh's thinking about retiring. You might consider him to maybe take the spot. So I had that first conversation during the wedding saying, would you be interested? I know you're on the board. I know this, but would you like to kind of take it up a notch? And he said, I'd think about it. He'd have to wind down some things. But in fact, that was the seed, and it was planted. And 5 months later, he became our executive director and would continue in that case until for 5 years. He committed to 5 years, and he did 5 years. His quote, and this is probably the best way to end it, is, Raleigh said, "What we will be striving to do is to be a place where this community and the world at large can come to know, appreciate, and learn the principles and ideas articulated in the life of Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson." And that mantra has in fact been what we've been using now under the leadership of Kristen McMahon now this past 25 years.